You can't survive without me, Lena Brooks. You're a housewife. What exactly do you plan to fight me with? Derek Brooks said this from the leather sofa we'd bought together when we got married. He lounged there with his legs crossed, a cup of the jasmine tea I had just brewed for him balanced in his hand. The steam curled upward in a thin, graceful ribbon, carrying the faint, floral fragrance through the living room. He was sunk deep into the cushions, his posture so relaxed, so utterly at ease, as comfortable as a king surveying his domain from a throne. The late afternoon sun fell through the window in long golden rectangles, catching the rim of the teacup, the polished wood of the coffee table, the silver in his hair that hadn't been there when we first met. He was wearing that deep blue shirt, the one whose cuff buttons I'd sewn back on last month after he complained that one was loose, the one whose collar I'd pressed flat with the iron just yesterday morning while he was still in the shower. The coffee table in front of him was polished to a soft, reflective gleam by my hands. The hardwood floor beneath his Italian leather loafers was spotless because I'd been on my hands and knees scrubbing it the day before, my knuckles raw from the brush. Out on the balcony, the laundry fluttered in the afternoon breeze. His shirts, Sophie's school uniforms, my own faded nightgowns, all of it washed and hung by me at dawn while the rest of the world was still asleep. He sat in the middle of everything I had built and maintained for 10 years, and he handed down his verdict as though it came from some unassailable height, as though the very air in the room owed its warmth to him. I stood there, still in the apron I'd put on to make his tea, looking at him. At this man I had married 10 years ago, this man whose body I knew as well as my own, the small mole behind his left ear, the way his shoulder blades tensed when he was stressed, the precise rhythm of his breathing when he drifted into sleep. This man whose moods I had learned to navigate like a sailor reading the sky, reading the tiny shifts in his expression, the micro-movements that signaled a storm coming or a rare moment of calm. I had spent a decade becoming fluent in Derek Brooks, and now, standing in front of him, I realized that fluency meant nothing. He had simply stopped being the person I learned. Behind him, on the wall, hung our wedding portrait. In the photograph, I wore a white dress and he wore a black suit. We were standing on a beach in Malibu, both of us laughing, the wind whipping my veil sideways. That day had been so blustery that his tie had blown crooked over his shoulder, and I'd reached up to straighten it, my fingers brushing the warm, sun-kissed skin of his neck. He'd bent down and kissed my forehead right then. A quick, impulsive, joyful kiss, and the photographer had caught that exact half-second. The two of us, windblown and foolish and absolutely, breathtakingly certain of each other. The picture had hung on that wall for 10 years. I had dusted its frame every single Saturday, careful around the edges, as if it were a sacred object. Now, 10 years later, he looked at me the way a person looks at a piece of furniture they're about to leave on the curb for trash pickup. There was no anger in his eyes. Anger would have meant he still cared, that some ember of passion still glowed beneath the ash. What I saw was far worse. The mild, distant irritation of someone dealing with an inconvenience. The look you give a slow barista, a delayed flight, a chore you have to repeat. Silence filled the room. The clock on the wall kept ticking, a sound that had marked the hours of my life for a decade, that I used to find comforting, the steady heartbeat of a home. Now it sounded like a countdown. In the kitchen, the faucet I'd asked him to fix back in March was still dripping, every drop hitting the stainless steel sink with a tiny, metallic click that I had learned to ignore but now felt like a small, persistent accusation. From the apartment upstairs, the muffled thump of a bass track filtered through the ceiling. Someone's afternoon playlist, the beat landing in the quiet room like a second, more urgent heartbeat. I became acutely aware of my own body. The way my hands were clasped in front of me, fingers interlaced so tightly the knuckles ached. The way my shoulders had crept up toward my ears without my noticing. The rapid, shallow flutter of my pulse at the base of my throat. I could feel the beginning of a headache pressing behind my right eye, the familiar tension that always arrived when Derek adopted this tone. The calm, reasonable, utterly condescending tone of a man explaining simple facts to a child. I opened my mouth. I wanted to say it all. I wanted to tell him that I'd woken up at 5 every morning for 10 years to make his breakfast. Eggs over easy, toast cut into triangles the way he liked, coffee brewed to the exact strength he preferred. I wanted to tell him that I'd given up a career I was genuinely proud of to raise our daughter, that I had walked away from promotions and mentorship and a future I had worked brutally hard to earn. I wanted to tell him that every time he'd worked late or flown off to a conference in some other city, I'd been the one holding this household together, paying the bills, scheduling the repairs, sitting alone at parent-teacher conferences while the other moms exchanged glances that mixed pity and judgment. I wanted to tell him that I had done all of this willingly, lovingly, because I believed in us, and that his current tone was the most profound betrayal of all. Not the infidelity I had sometimes suspected, not the late nights, not the drinking, but this casual, absolute dismissal of everything I had given. The words gathered in my throat like a physical weight, pressing against my windpipe, and for a moment I thought I might actually say them. But then I swallowed, and the words went back down, because I knew, with the sudden, terrible clarity that sometimes arrives in moments of crisis, that it would not matter. It wasn't that he didn't know. He knew perfectly well. He knew every single thing I had sacrificed, and he had simply decided, somewhere along the way, that none of it counted. That my sacrifices were not sacrifices at all, but simply the natural order of things. The sun rises. The tides come in. Lena makes breakfast. None of it requires gratitude. Derek saw my silence and misinterpreted it as surrender, as he always did, as he had been doing for years. He set his teacup down on the coaster with a deliberate, almost theatrical gentleness, pushed himself up from the sofa, and walked over to me. His shoes made a soft, measured sound on the hardwood floor. He stood half a head taller than me, close enough that I could smell his cologne, the same one he'd worn since our wedding, sandalwood, and something else, something sharp. When he looked down at me, his eyes carried that particular kind of condescending pity that a man reserves for a woman he believes has no options left. Lena, if you're smart, you won't fight me on this. His voice was low and smooth, the voice he used to close deals. You haven't worked in 10 years. Do you have any idea what the job market is like out there? Do you read the news? You're in your mid-30s. Who's going to hire you? What skills do you even have anymore? Rent, utilities, Sophie's tuition. You have no idea what things cost now, do you? I've handled all of that for a decade. You've been protected from the real world. He paused, letting the words sink in, watching my face for cracks. When I didn't react, he continued, his tone hardening slightly. You want a divorce? Fine. Sophie stays with me. I'm her father. I have a stable job, a good income, this condo. No court in the country is going to side with an unemployed mother over me, and you know it. The condo is my premarital property. My lawyer confirmed it. You walk away with nothing. No alimony, no assets, no child support beyond the bare minimum the state requires. He paused again, and when he spoke next, his voice dropped into something colder and more deliberate, the voice of a man who believes he is being generous. If you behave yourself, I might let you keep living here for a while. Give you time to figure things out. But if you insist on making a scene, if you try to drag this through the courts and embarrass me in front of everyone we know, don't expect me to go easy on you just because we used to be something to each other. That last phrase, used to be something to each other, landed in my chest like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples spread outward, cold and precise. Used to be. Past tense. He was already living in a world where our marriage was over, and he was simply waiting for me to catch up. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known, standing there in his expensive shirt with his expensive confidence, was that in my silence, something was already shifting. Beneath the surface of my stillness, a decision was crystallizing, quiet and hard as a diamond forming under pressure. It didn't announce itself with a shout or a surge of adrenaline. It was cold. It was calm. It was the coldest, calmest thing I had ever felt. I didn't answer him. I just stood there, holding his gaze, and for a fraction of a second I saw something flicker in his eyes. Confusion, maybe, or the faintest shadow of unease. He was used to me crying, used to me pleading, used to me folding. My stillness was unfamiliar. It didn't fit the script. But he recovered quickly. He always did. He gave a small, dismissive shake of his head, the gesture of a man who has explained something perfectly obvious and is disappointed that his audience hasn't immediately understood, and walked past me toward the bedroom. Think about what I said, he called over his shoulder. It's the best offer you're going to get. The bedroom door clicked shut. I remained standing in the living room, alone, the ticking of the clock and the dripping of the faucet and the distant thump of the bass forming a strange, syncopated rhythm around me. The sun had shifted, the golden rectangles on the floor stretching longer, thinner, retreating toward the windows. I looked at the wedding portrait on the wall, at the woman in the white dress, laughing into the wind, at the man whose tie was crooked, whose head was bent to kiss her forehead. We had been so young, so impossibly young, and so impossibly certain. I had loved him with a love that felt unshakable, oceanic, eternal. And now here I was, 10 years later, standing in the wreckage of that certainty, and the only thing I could think was, what would that woman in the photograph say if she could see me now? Would she recognize me? Would she be horrified? Or would she, in some terrible act of prescience, understand exactly how this story was going to unfold? That night, after Sophie was asleep, I sat in the dark living room and didn't turn on the lights. I sat on the sofa where Derek had delivered his verdict, and I let the silence wrap around me like a shroud. The streetlight outside the window cast a pale orange glow across the ceiling. I could hear Sophie's breathing through the thin wall, slow and steady, the most beautiful sound in the world. I thought about the woman I used to be. Lena Brooks, née Lena Chun, daughter of immigrants, first in her family to graduate from college. Lena Brooks, who had won the Anderson Scholarship at Northwestern. Lena Brooks, who had walked into Meridian Financial at 23 and been told by her supervisor Fiona Mercer that she had the sharpest analytical mind I've seen in a decade. Lena Brooks, who used to stay late at the office not because she had to, but because she loved the work, loved the clean logic of the numbers, the elegant architecture of a well-built model, the quiet thrill of a correct prediction. Where had that woman gone? I had not noticed her leaving. She had slipped away gradually, day by day, one small compromise at a time, until one morning I woke up and she was simply gone. In her place was a woman who spent her days worrying about grocery lists and laundry schedules and whether Derek would be in a good mood when he came home. A woman whose entire emotional landscape was shaped by the unpredictable weather of her husband's temperament. But as I sat there in the dark, something unexpected happened. Instead of the familiar tide of self-pity, I felt something else rising, something hotter, something that started in my stomach and spread upward through my chest, making my hands tremble and my jaw tighten. Anger, not the helpless, tearful anger of a victim, but something harder, something that felt almost like power. It was the anger of a woman who had finally, after 10 years of half-conscious denial, allowed herself to see the truth of her situation and had decided, in that same instant, to change it. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the sofa and watched the sky lighten outside the window, the orange streetlight fading into the gray of early dawn. When the first birds began to sing, I stood up, walked to the bathroom, and looked at myself in the mirror. The face that looked back was tired. There were dark circles under her eyes and the beginning of lines around her mouth. Her hair was dull, her skin pale, her shoulders slumped. But her eyes were different. There was something alive in them that hadn't been there the day before. I said it out loud, quietly, so as not to wake Sophie. Lena, you've died once already. From today on, you're someone else. My name is Lena Brooks, and I am 35 years old. 10 years ago, at 25, I walked into Fiona Mercer's office at Meridian Financial and told her I was resigning. I remember the precise quality of the light that morning, the way the autumn sun came through her floor-to-ceiling windows and pooled on her desk, the way the dust motes floated in the beams like tiny, suspended stars. I remember the weight of the resignation letter in my hand, the way the paper felt thick and official, the way my signature looked at the bottom, final, irrevocable. Fiona looked at me across her desk. She was 42 then, silver already threading through her short dark hair, her eyes sharp and kind and deeply, deeply tired. She had been my mentor for 2 years, and in that time she had taught me more than anyone else in my life. She had taught me how to read a balance sheet like a detective reads a crime scene, how to build a model that could withstand any stress test, how to present to a boardroom full of men who assumed you were the assistant and make them forget, within 5 minutes, that they had ever underestimated you. Lena, sit down, she said. I sat. She didn't look at the letter immediately. She looked at me, really looked, the way she always did, as if she could see straight through the surface of whatever you were presenting and into the truth beneath. You're leaving, she said. It wasn't a question. I'm getting married, I said. Derek, my fiancé, he works at a bank. He makes good money. He says I don't need to work anymore. He wants me to stay home, raise our children, take care of the household. And I want that too. The words came out in a rush, rehearsed and slightly defensive, as if I were trying to convince myself as much as her. Fiona was silent for a long moment. She picked up a pen from her desk and turned it over in her fingers, a habit she had when she was choosing her words carefully. Lena, she said finally, you are one of the most talented analysts I have ever trained. And I'm not saying that to flatter you. I'm saying it because it's true. You have a gift for this work, and you have a future here that most people in this industry would kill for. If you leave now, coming back is going to be nearly impossible. This field changes every 6 months. The models you know will be obsolete. The software will be different. Your network will atrophy. Even a year or two away will set you back to the starting line. And starting over in your mid-30s, she paused, and her voice softened. It's brutal, Lena. I've seen it. I've seen too many brilliant women walk out that door and never make it back. I felt a flash of irritation. She didn't understand. She couldn't possibly understand. Derek and I were different. Our love was different. He wasn't like those other husbands Fiona had probably watched destroy her protégés. He was kind and supportive, and he believed in me, and we were going to build a beautiful life together. Fiona, I appreciate your concern, I said, my voice cooler than I intended. But I've made up my mind. Derek is going to take care of me. I want to be home with my kids. There's more to life than work. The moment the words left my mouth, I regretted them. It was a cheap, dismissive thing to say to a woman who had poured so much of herself into my growth. But Fiona didn't flinch. She just looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something suspended between sadness and resignation, as if she had heard these exact words from too many other young women, as if she knew precisely how this story ended and had learned not to argue with its beginning. Then I wish you well, she said quietly. Truly, on my last day, she walked me to the elevator. I was carrying a cardboard box of my desk things, a small plant, a coffee mug, a framed photo of Derek and me at the Grand Canyon. Fiona stood with her hands in the pockets of her blazer, her posture straight and composed. Just before the elevator doors closed, I glanced back at her. Her face held an expression I couldn't decipher then, something suspended between warning and grief. Later, much later, I would understand it. She had seen too many women like me. Too many sharp, ambitious, capable women who handed their futures to a man's conscience and trusted him to keep it safe. And she had seen, over and over, what happened when that conscience evaporated. But I didn't understand any of that back then. Back then, the elevator doors slid shut, and I walked out into the Chicago autumn sunshine, and the only thing on my mind was what to make for dinner that night. 10 years. How many decades does a person get? Who did I give the best 10 years of my life to? In those 10 years, I woke up at 5:30 every single morning. Not 5:30 most mornings, every morning. Weekdays, weekends, holidays, it didn't matter. The alarm would ring, and I would slap it off before the first note finished, terrified that the sound would wake Derek. He was a light sleeper, he always said, though curiously he could sleep through Sophie's crying but not through the faint buzz of my alarm. I would creep out of bed, my feet silent on the cold floor, and make my way to the kitchen in the dark. I learned to navigate by touch, the edge of the dresser, the door frame. The light switch I would only flip once the kitchen door was closed so the brightness wouldn't leak into the hallway. I would rinse the rice, chop the vegetables, stir-fry the side dishes. Derek had very particular tastes. He liked his congee with century egg and lean pork, but not too much pork. He liked his eggs over easy, the whites fully set but the yolks still runny, and if the edges were the slightest bit brown, he would push the plate away with a sigh. He hated cilantro, the smell of it, the taste of it, the very existence of it, so for 10 years I never allowed a single sprig of cilantro into the house. I would check every takeout order, every packaged food, every herb bundle from the grocery store. He hated ginger, so I sliced it into pieces big enough for him to pick out easily, and if I ever forgot, if a small piece of minced ginger made it into his mouth, his face would twist into an expression of genuine betrayal. I knew all of this. I knew him the way a cartographer knows a coastline. Every inlet, every shoal, every hidden rock. And I adjusted myself around his needs so completely, so continuously, that I stopped noticing I was doing it. It became the water I swam in. the air I breathed. When Sophie was born, I had an emergency C-section after 18 hours of labor. The anesthesiologist had trouble placing the epidural, and for a terrifying stretch of time, I felt more than I should have. The incision afterward was a raw, searing line of pain that made it impossible to stand up straight, impossible to laugh, impossible to sneeze without feeling like my abdomen was being torn open. But I still had to haul myself upright every 2 hours to nurse, because Sophie was colicky and wouldn't take a bottle, and the lactation consultant said consistency was crucial. Derek slept in the guest room. He said he needed uninterrupted rest because he had important meetings during the day. He said it with such matter-of-fact confidence that I didn't even question it. Of course his sleep was more important than mine. Of course his work was more demanding than recovering from major surgery while keeping a newborn alive. That was simply the truth of our arrangement. So I spent my entire recovery alone, in the small hours of the night, the wound still healing, the scar across my belly a raw, crooked seam like a pink centipede. I would sit up in bed holding Sophie, my back screaming in protest, and when she cried, which was often, which was always, I would cry with her. Not loud, heaving sobs. Quiet tears. The kind of crying you do when you don't want to wake anyone. When you've learned that your distress is a private affair that shouldn't inconvenience others. At dawn, when the sky outside the nursery window began to lighten, my milk would run low and I would shuffle to the kitchen to mix formula, my incision pulling with every step. Derek would wake up, well-rested and freshly showered, and come into the nursery to check on us. He would look at Sophie, then at me, and say something like, "You look exhausted," or, "Why is your supply so low?" Not with concern, but with a faint, puzzled disappointment, as if my body were an appliance that wasn't performing to specifications. Then he would kiss Sophie on the forehead, grab his briefcase, and leave for the office. And I would be alone again, with the baby and the pain and the creeping, unnameable dread that I had made a very serious mistake. When Sophie was 3, she came down with a fever that hit 104 degrees in the middle of the night. Her little body was burning to the touch, her face flushed crimson, her breathing fast and shallow. I wrapped her in a blanket, threw on whatever clothes I could find, and drove to the emergency room. Derek was out at a client dinner, some important account he'd been courting for months, and when I called his phone, it went straight to voicemail. I called again, and again, and again, 16 times over the course of the night. He never picked up. I sat in the ER waiting room for 4 hours, Sophie limp and feverish in my arms, surrounded by the fluorescent glare and the smell of antiseptic and the muted sounds of other people's emergencies. When they finally called our name, the nurse took one look at Sophie's temperature and rushed us into an examination room. They put in 4 in her tiny arm. She screamed. She screamed in a way that I will never forget, a sound that seemed to come from some primal place beyond pain. And I held her hand and stroked her hair and whispered things I don't remember, things I hoped were soothing but probably weren't. The nurse looked at me, at my red-rimmed eyes and my rumpled clothes, and asked, "Is her father on his way?" "Business trip," I lied. The lie came out so easily, so automatically, that I barely registered it. I had become fluent in covering for Derek's absences. He wasn't on a business trip. He was 15 minutes away, at a steakhouse in River North, the same one where we'd celebrated our 5th anniversary. He was clinking glasses with clients and telling stories and being charming, while I held our daughter's hand in a hospital room and prayed to a God I wasn't sure I believed in. We got home at 3 in the morning. The streetlight outside our building was broken. It had been broken for weeks, and Derek kept saying he would call the management company, and the stairwell was pitch black. I carried Sophie up 4 flights of stairs, her weight heavy in my exhausted arms, my thighs burning, my breath coming in ragged gasps. When I finally got the door open, Derek was on the sofa, asleep, the TV flickering blue light across his face. On the coffee table were 2 empty beer bottles and the remains of a takeout pizza. I stood there in the doorway, Sophie asleep against my shoulder, and looked at him, at the soft, untroubled rise and fall of his chest, at the way his mouth was slightly open, his face slack with the deep, peaceful sleep of a man who had done nothing wrong. The next morning, when he woke up, I confronted him. My voice was calm, but there was something trembling beneath it, something I was working very hard to control. "Sophie had a 104-degree fever last night. I called you 16 times. Why didn't you answer?" "I was with clients," he said, not looking up from his phone. Didn't hear it. His tone was completely flat, utterly unbothered, as if I'd asked him about the weather. As if our daughter's terrifying, middle-of-the-night emergency was an item on a checklist he'd simply forgotten to tick off. Then he glanced at my face, at the dark circles, the puffy eyes, the general exhaustion written into every feature. And his expression shifted into something that might have been concern but was actually, I now realize, annoyance. "You look terrible," he said. "You've got bags under your eyes. Do something about that before you go outside. You'll embarrass yourself." I stood in the kitchen doorway, holding the breakfast I had just made him. Eggs over easy, toast triangles, coffee brewed to his exact preference, and I had absolutely nothing to say. The words simply stopped. It was as if some internal circuit breaker had tripped, shutting down the part of my brain that believed communication was possible. Because in that moment, I finally understood something I had been avoiding for years. This man did not see me as a person. He saw me as a function, a service, an appliance that made breakfast and raised his child and maintained his household. And when the appliance showed signs of wear, he was irritated by its declining performance. That was the moment I should have left. I know that now. I should have put down the plate, walked into the bedroom, and started packing. But I didn't. I told myself he was stressed, overworked, going through something. I told myself things would get better when Sophie started kindergarten, when he got the promotion, when we finally took that vacation to Hawaii we kept talking about. I told myself 1,000 stories, each one more elaborate than the last, because the alternative, the truth, was too terrifying to face. The truth was that I had given up my career, my independence, my very sense of self, and I had nothing to show for it but a marriage to a man who didn't even like me anymore. So I waited. I waited for a better that was never going to arrive. And in the waiting, I disappeared a little more each day. The change came gradually, over years. It was like a faucet beginning to leak. At first you don't notice, just a drop here and there, a small, intermittent sound in the background of your life. Then one day you look down, and the sink is full, and you can't remember when it started. First, the late nights at the office multiplied. He used to come home by 7, then it was 8, then 9, then sometimes not until after I was already in bed, the front door clicking open in the darkness, the fridge opening and closing, the shower running. I would lie there in the dark, listening to the sounds of him moving through the apartment without me, and I would feel a loneliness so vast and so complete that it seemed to have its own physical weight. Then the weekends. He used to take Sophie to the park on Saturday mornings, a ritual she adored. He would push her on the swings and catch her at the bottom of the slide, and I would stand at the window and watch them, my heart so full I thought it might burst. But gradually, the park trips stopped. He had golf with clients. He had a conference call. He had a headache. He was tired. He just needed to rest. The excuses piled up like snow, each one small and insignificant on its own, together forming a drift that buried everything. Then he stopped talking to me. Not the silence of an argument. That was different. That still had heat in it, still carried the possibility of resolution. This was the silence of indifference. The silence of having absolutely nothing left to say. He would come home, collapse on the sofa, and scroll through his phone for hours, the blue light illuminating his face, his thumb moving in a hypnotic rhythm. I would try to tell him about my day, something Sophie had said, a funny encounter at the grocery store, a news story I thought he'd find interesting. And he would grunt without looking up, or worse, not respond at all, as if my voice were just another ambient sound he had learned to filter out. During dinner, he would prop his phone against the salt shaker and watch videos, earbuds in, the tinny sound of some podcast or sports commentary leaking out. I would sit across from him, eating my food in silence, and I would wonder when exactly my husband had become a stranger who happened to live in the same apartment. At night, he would turn his back to me in bed, the curve of his spine like a wall I was no longer allowed to cross, and I would stare at his shoulder blades in the darkness and feel the distance between us like a physical chasm. He began to criticize me. Not the occasional, gentle complaint of a long marriage. These were different, sharper, more deliberate. He criticized my cooking. Too salty, too bland, too greasy, no flavor. Why can't you get this right? It's not that hard. He criticized my appearance. Why don't you dress up anymore? You used to be so pretty. Look at yourself. He criticized my conversation. You don't know anything about what's going on in the world. All you talk about is Sophie and the house. It's like talking to a wall. He criticized my very existence in the home he paid for. Do you have any idea how hard I work? Do you know what I deal with every day? And you just sit here spending my money. The clothes I bought were frumpy. The books I read were trash. The thoughts I had were boring. I had shrunk, in his eyes, from a partner to a dependent to a burden, and he wanted me to know it. He wanted me to feel it every single day, in 1,000 small, undetectable ways. Once, he brought colleagues home for dinner, a marketing team he was trying to impress. I spent the entire day preparing, cleaning the apartment until it gleamed, setting the table with the good china, cooking 8 dishes from scratch. I braised the pork belly for 2 hours, blanching the meat 3 times to get the texture exactly right. When the sugar caramelized in the wok, a splash of hot oil flew up and raised an angry red blister on the back of my hand. But I didn't stop. I just ran it under cold water for a minute and kept cooking. At the table, Derek picked up a piece of the pork belly with his chopsticks, examined it critically, and put it in his mouth. He chewed once, twice. Then he made a face, a small, theatrical grimace, and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "This is way too greasy. You're home all day, and you can't even get one decent dish on the table? What exactly do you do with your time?" The table went silent. His colleagues shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances. One of them, a young woman with kind eyes, tried to smooth it over. "I think it's delicious, seriously. Really flavorful." But Derek just shook his head and said, with the absolute confidence of a man who believes his opinion is objective truth, "You guys are just being polite. Trust me, this isn't what it's supposed to taste like." I felt the heat rise to my face, not the heat of embarrassment, though there was plenty of that, but the heat of something sharper, something closer to humiliation. I picked up the dish and carried it back to the kitchen, my hands trembling so badly the plates rattled. I closed the door behind me, set the dish on the counter, and crouched down next to the stove, my back against the cabinet. The oil in the wok was still popping faintly. The blister on my hand had burst, and dish soap from the sink had seeped into the raw skin, stinging so sharply that tears sprang to my eyes. Or maybe the tears were already there. Maybe they had been gathering all evening. I crouched on the kitchen floor, listening to the muffled sound of Derek's voice through the door, the occasional burst of laughter, and I thought, this is my life. This is the life I chose. I chose this man. I chose to leave my job. I chose to believe him when he said he would take care of me. Every step of this journey was a choice I made, and now I was living with the consequences. And the consequences were a man who humiliated me in front of his colleagues, and a blister on my hand, and a kitchen floor that needed mopping. That was the first time I asked myself, genuinely and without self-pity, "Lena, what the hell kind of life is this?" The afternoon of the slap, the afternoon I finally decided to leave, began like any other. I spent the morning cleaning the apartment, grocery shopping, prepping dinner. Sophie was at school. Derek was at work. The apartment was quiet, filled with the ordinary sounds of a Tuesday. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant drone of a lawnmower, the occasional bark of a neighbor's dog. That evening was Sophie's school showcase. She had been talking about it for weeks, her small face alight with excitement. She had won a progress award. Her teacher said she had improved more than any other student in her reading level, and she had been chosen to give a short presentation on behalf of her class. She practiced every night, standing in front of the bathroom mirror in her pajamas, reciting her lines with the exaggerated seriousness of a 7-year-old. "Welcome, parents and teachers," she would say, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Today we are going to share with you what we've been learning about the solar system." She would stumble over solar system every time. It came out as solar system, and I would smile and help her sound it out, and she would try again, her determination fierce and beautiful. "Mommy, you have to be there," she told me, tugging at my sleeve. "You have to. Promise." "I promise, sweetheart. I wouldn't miss it for the world." I told Derek about it days in advance. I reminded him that morning. I sent him a text at lunch. "Sophie's showcase is at 6:30 tonight. Please come home early to watch her so I can go." He replied with a single word, "K." At 6, Sophie and I were ready. She was wearing her new dress, a pale blue one we'd picked out together at Target, with a ribbon at the waist and a skirt that flared when she spun. I had curled her hair, or tried to, The curls were already falling out, but she didn't care. She kept running to the mirror to look at herself, then running back to me. Do I look pretty, Mommy? You look beautiful, sweetheart. At 6:15, I called Derek. Voicemail. 6:30. Voicemail. 6:45. The showcase was starting. Sophie's face, which had been glowing all evening, began to dim. Is Daddy coming? She asked, and I could hear the hope in her voice, the fragile, heartbreaking hope of a child who still believes her father will show up. He's just running late, baby. Traffic. At 7, I called again. 7:15. 7:30. The showcase would be over by 8. Sophie was sitting on the sofa in her blue dress, her hands folded in her lap, staring at the floor. She wasn't crying, but the expression on her face was so much worse than tears. It was the heavy, resigned disappointment of a child who has learned, far too young, that promises don't mean anything. That look hit me like a physical blow, a needle driven straight into the softest part of my heart. I called Derek one last time. 8 times I had called. On the 9th, he picked up, and I heard the unmistakable chaos of a bar in the background. Loud music, the clink of glasses, the roar of a crowd watching a game. I'm with clients, he said, his voice already defensive. What do you want? Sophie's showcase is tonight. You promised you'd be home. So go. You're her mother. I need someone to watch her. You said you'd be here. Look, taking care of the kid is your job. Making money is my job. Don't push your responsibilities onto me. Figure it out. And then the line went dead. I called back. His phone was off. I didn't make it to the showcase. I sat on the sofa next to Sophie and recorded a video on my phone. Sophie, Mommy is so sorry she can't be there, but I am so proud of you, and I know you're going to be amazing tonight. Sophie watched me record it in silence, her expression unreadable. When I put the phone down, she turned her face away. Derek rolled in after 9, reeking of whiskey. His tie was yanked halfway down his chest, his shirt untucked, his eyes glassy. He kicked off his shoes. They flew across the room and hit the wall, and collapsed onto the sofa, the same sofa where Sophie had sat all evening waiting for him. Make me some tea, he said, his words slurring slightly. I made the tea. I brought it to him. He took a sip and his face contorted. This is too hot. Make it again. His voice was petulant, the voice of a man who has been drinking for hours and expects the world to accommodate his every whim. I stood there, holding the cup, and something in me, some last, fraying thread of patience or hope or self-deception, finally snapped. You missed Sophie's whole night, I said, my voice low. She waited for you. She sat on this sofa for 2 hours waiting for you, and you couldn't even answer your phone. Do you have any idea what that did to her? And that was when he exploded. It came without warning, a sudden, volcanic detonation, as if some buried charge that had been accumulating pressure for years had finally found its fuse. He surged to his feet, his face contorting with a rage I had never seen before, not in 10 years of marriage, not in any of our worst fights. He swept his arm across the coffee table and sent the teacup flying. It smashed against the hardwood floor, porcelain shards scattering everywhere, scalding tea splashing across the wood, across my bare feet, across the rug we had bought together at a flea market on our 3rd anniversary. And then he hit me. His hand came out of nowhere, a backhanded slap, fast and brutal and precise, catching me across the left side of my face. The sound of it was like a gunshot in the quiet apartment. My head snapped sideways. My ear began to ring, a high, keening whine that blotted out every other sound. I staggered backward, my hand flying to my cheek, and for a moment the world seemed to tilt and swim, the edges of my vision going gray. You're a housewife, he said, and his voice was eerily calm now, low and measured, each word a nail being hammered into my skin. You have one job. One. And you can't even handle it. What the hell are you good for? I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. I stood there with my hand pressed to my burning cheek, staring at this man I had loved, this man I had trusted, this man I had given 10 years of my life to, and I felt something inside me break. Not crack, not fracture, break. A clean, irrevocable split, like a bone snapping under too much pressure. Sophie came flying out of her room. She must have heard the crash, the slap, the shouting. She was barefoot, her pajama top buttoned wrong, her hair wild from sleep. The moment she saw me, standing in the wreckage of the living room, my hand against my face, tears streaming down my cheeks that I hadn't even realized I was crying. Her own face crumpled, and she burst into tears. But she didn't run to me. Not at first. She ran between us. She planted her small, barefoot body directly in front of me, facing her father, and she screamed at him with a fury that no 7-year-old should be capable of. "Daddy, stop. You're mean. Don't you hit my mommy." Derek stared at her, his chest heaving, his face still twisted with anger. "Go back to your room," he growled. "This is between adults." Sophie didn't move. She held her ground, those two thin arms of hers stretched out to either side like a tiny, trembling shield. Her shoulders were shaking, and I could see the tears streaming down her face, but she did not budge. She stood there, all 40 pounds of her, and she defended me. Derek looked at her, then at me, and something in his face flickered. Not remorse, never that, but a kind of irritation, as if this emotional scene were an inconvenience he hadn't signed up for. He made a dismissive sound in the back of his throat, turned on his heel, and walked into the bedroom, slamming the door so hard the frame rattled. And then it was just the two of us, Sophie and me, standing in the middle of the wreckage, the shattered porcelain, the spilled tea, Sophie's blue dress crumpled on the floor where she had thrown it in her rush to reach me. She turned around and threw her arms around my legs, burying her face in my stomach, sobbing so hard her whole body shook. "Mommy, Mommy, don't cry," she kept saying, over and over, even though she was crying herself. "Don't cry, Mommy. I'll protect you." I knelt down and wrapped my arms around her, holding her so tight I was probably hurting her, but I couldn't let go. I buried my face in her hair. It smelled like strawberry shampoo, the kind she picked out herself at the drugstore, and I cried. Not the quiet, restrained crying I had learned over 10 years of suppressing my emotions. Real crying. Ugly crying. The kind of crying that comes from somewhere so deep it feels like it might tear you apart. We stayed like that for a long time, the two of us, holding each other in the dark living room while the clock ticked on the wall and the faucet dripped in the kitchen and the music from upstairs thumped its distant, indifferent rhythm. That night, after I finally got Sophie to sleep, she refused to let go of my hand, and I had to sit by her bed until her breathing slowed and her grip relaxed. I walked back into the living room and sat down on the sofa. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't clean up the shattered teacup. I just sat there in the darkness, the mark of Derek's hand still burning on my cheek, and I asked myself the question that had been lurking at the edges of my consciousness for years. How did I get here? I pulled out my phone and opened the photo gallery. I scrolled back, past the pictures of Sophie's birthday parties and Derek's company picnics, past the careful, curated images of our supposedly happy life. I kept scrolling until I found photos from before Derek, before Sophie, before I became someone's wife and someone's mother and stopped being someone at all. There I was, college Lena, with short, choppy hair and a white button-down shirt, standing in front of the Northwestern campus gate, grinning at the camera like the world was a gift she couldn't wait to unwrap. There I was at my desk at Meridian Financial, the loop skyline visible through the window behind me, 3 monitors glowing with data, my fingers poised over the keyboard, my expression focused and serene and absolutely certain of its place in the world. There I was on a hiking trip in Colorado, sunburned and sweat-soaked and laughing, my backpack enormous, my legs strong, my future wide open. I stared at those images, and the tears came again. But they were different tears now. Not sad, not defeated, angry. A hot, clean, clarifying anger that burned through the fog of self-pity and lit up everything I had been refusing to see. I had let this happen. Not all of it. Not the slap. Not his cruelty. Those were his choices, his sins. But I had let myself become this diminished, dependent, frightened version of myself. I had handed my life to someone else and asked him, politely, to take care of it. And he had dropped it. And now it was up to me to pick it up. I looked out the window. The sky was beginning to lighten, that deep, velvety blue of pre-dawn giving way to a pale strip of gray on the horizon. The birds were starting their morning songs, tentative at first, then bolder. The world was waking up, and so was I. I put my phone down. I walked to the bathroom and looked at myself in the mirror. The face that looked back was a mess. Red eyes, swollen lips, a darkening bruise blooming across her left cheekbone like a storm cloud. But her eyes were different. There was something in them that hadn't been there the night before. Something hard. Something unbroken. I looked at that woman in the mirror and I said, out loud, in the quiet of the early morning, Lena Brooks, you died tonight. The woman who believed him, the woman who waited for him, the woman who made his breakfast and ironed his shirts and apologized for his mistakes, she's gone. From today on, you're someone else. Someone who doesn't kneel. Then I opened the medicine cabinet, took out the concealer, and carefully covered the bruise on my cheek. I had a week of planning ahead of me, and I couldn't afford to look like a victim. I told Derek I wanted a divorce 7 days later. 7 days of preparation. 7 days of gathering documents, of quietly copying bank statements, of documenting his income and our assets and the paper trail of his neglect. He assumed I was helpless. He had always assumed I was helpless, but he forgot that I was a finance professional by training. Forensic accounting was never a problem for me. I could read a balance sheet like a novelist reads a character, and the story these numbers told was damning. I chose a quiet Sunday afternoon, when he was sober and hadn't been called into work and was in a relatively stable mood. Sophie was at a playdate with a friend from school. I had arranged it deliberately, making sure she would be out of the apartment. I walked into the living room, sat down on the chair across from the sofa. Not the sofa itself, I would never sit on that sofa again. And I told him, calmly and clearly, that I wanted a divorce. He stared at me for a long moment, processing. Then he laughed. Not a real laugh, but a short, incredulous bark of disbelief. Have you lost your mind? No, I said. I've been thinking about this for a long time. I've made up my mind. He leaned back into the sofa, crossed his legs, and fixed me with a look of pure, unadulterated ridicule. It was almost impressive, the amount of contempt he could fit into a single expression. The look said, You think you can leave me? You think you have any power here at all? Divorce? He said, drawing the word out like it was a joke he wanted to savor. With what? You haven't worked in a decade. Do you even know what the job market looks like? You're 35 years old. Who's going to hire someone with a 10-year gap in her resume? You probably can't even write a cover letter anymore. What are you going to do? Put homemaker under work experience. Good luck with that. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his voice dropping into a tone of false concern that was somehow more insulting than open hostility. You can't survive without me, Lena. I'm not saying this to be cruel. I'm saying it because it's true. You have no job, no income, no references, no network. You've been out of the game for 10 years. The world has moved on without you. If you walk out that door, you'll be back within a month, begging me to take you in. I'm trying to save you from yourself. I said nothing. I just watched him, my face calm, my hands folded in my lap. I could see my lack of reaction unsettling him. He was used to me crying. He was used to me crumbling. This quiet, patient stillness was something he didn't recognize, and it made him nervous. Fine, he said, his voice hardening. You want a divorce? Here's what's going to happen. Sophie stays with me. I'm her father. I have a stable job, a good income, a home. No court in this state is going to give custody to an unemployed mother with no means of support. The condo is my premarital property. My name is on the deed, not yours. You walk away with nothing. No assets. No alimony. The bare minimum of child support the state requires. He paused, and then he delivered the line I had been waiting for. The line I knew was coming because it was the logical culmination of everything he had been saying for years. But if you behave yourself, if you don't make a scene, I might let you stay here for a while. Give you time to figure something out. I'm being generous, Lena. You should recognize that. Generous. The word almost made me laugh. Almost. I don't want the condo, I said, my voice steady. I don't want your money. I just want Sophie. He laughed again. That same dismissive, incredulous laugh. Fine. Take her. I'll give you a few $100 a month in child support. Consider it a parting gift. Go on. Take Sophie and see how long you last. $300. That didn't even cover Sophie's after-school art program. He knew that. He was doing it deliberately. He was setting me up to fail, and he was absolutely certain that I would. That within weeks, I would be at his door, hat in hand, admitting defeat. Okay, I said. He blinked. Okay. I stood up. I'll take Sophie and I'll go. I walked into the bedroom and started packing. I moved methodically, without hurry, folding clothes into suitcases, gathering Sophie's favorite books, her stuffed rabbit, her art supplies. I could hear Derek in the living room, still sitting on the sofa, probably processing the fact that his script had gone off the rails. I imagined him replaying the conversation, trying to figure out where he had miscalculated. Sophie came home from her playdate an hour later. She saw the suitcases in the hallway and looked up at me, her expression shifting from confusion to something more complicated, a child's intuition, a sense that something momentous was happening. "Mommy, where are we going?" I knelt down to her level. "We're going to a new home, sweetheart. Just you and me." She was quiet for a moment, processing this. Then she asked, very seriously, "Is Daddy coming?" "No, Daddy's not coming." She looked down at her feet. I braced myself for tears, for arguments, for the inevitable, "I want to stay with Daddy." But Sophie didn't do any of those things. She looked up at me, and her face was calm, calmer than a 7-year-old's face should ever be in such a moment. She nodded once, a small, deliberate motion, like a tiny adult making a momentous decision. Then she said, "Okay, I'll go pack my school bag." And that was it. That was how I walked out of that apartment, 2 suitcases in my hands, Sophie's small fingers wrapped around mine, her school bag bumping against her back. The hallway was silent. The elevator took forever, and when the doors finally opened, there was a neighbor inside, an older woman I recognized from the 4th floor, the one who always commented on Sophie's Halloween costumes. She looked at my suitcases, opened her mouth, and then closed it again and stared fixedly at the floor numbers. I understood. Everyone in the building probably knew. Derek had never been quiet about his displeasure with me. He had never bothered to close the windows when he screamed. Outside, the evening air was cool and fresh, carrying the faint scent of rain. I hailed a cab, an actual yellow cab, the kind you see in movies, and the driver, a heavy-set man with a kindly face, helped me load the suitcases into the trunk. "Vacation?" he asked. "Moving," I said. He glanced at Sophie, who was already buckling her seatbelt, her face pressed to the window. He didn't ask any more questions. He just nodded, got behind the wheel, and pulled into the stream of evening traffic. I watched the city slide past the window. The coffee shop on the corner where I used to take Sophie for hot chocolate. The park where I pushed her on the swings. The grocery store where I had learned to stretch every dollar until it screamed. I had lived in this neighborhood from age 25 to 35. My entire adult life was here, woven into the fabric of these streets, these buildings, these sidewalks. And now I was leaving it, with nothing but my daughter and 2 suitcases and a bruise fading under my concealer. Sophie fell asleep against my shoulder, her breathing slow and even. I stroked her hair and watched the familiar landmarks recede in the rearview mirror, one by one, like a life I was saying goodbye to. The apartment I rented was on the far south side of the city, in a neighborhood that hadn't yet been touched by gentrification. The building was old and slightly shabby, with a flickering fluorescent light in the hallway and an elevator that groaned alarmingly every time it moved. The unit itself was barely 400 square feet, a shoebox compared to the condo. The bedroom fit a single bed and a narrow dresser. The living area was crammed with a second-hand futon and a folding table I'd bought from a thrift store for $20. The kitchen was so small you could stand in the middle and touch all 4 walls without stretching. Sophie got the bedroom. I slept on the futon in the living room, its metal frame digging into my back every time I shifted position. The first night, I lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the building, the creak of pipes, the distant murmur of a neighbor's television, the occasional siren wailing past on the street below. The futon springs squeaked every time I breathed. The ceiling had a water stain in one corner that looked vaguely like a map of Florida. But lying there in the dark, staring at that water stain, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not happiness. Happiness was still a long way off, but peace. The deep, quiet peace of a woman who has finally, after years of pretending, stopped lying to herself. Because I was free. The days after the divorce were some of the hardest of my life. Harder, in their own way, than the years of marriage that had preceded them. At least in the marriage, there had been a routine, a structure, however toxic. Now there was nothing but open, terrifying possibility. I spent 2 weeks job hunting and sent out more than 50 resumes. I tailored each one carefully, trying to bridge the 10-year gap with honest language about my experience and my skills and my eagerness to return to the workforce. I wrote cover letters that I labored over for hours, trying to strike the right balance between confidence and humility, between acknowledging my absence and insisting on my value. Every single application vanished into the void. I didn't even get rejection emails from most of them. Just silence, the absolute, demoralizing silence of an inbox that never pinged. The few responses I did get were worse than silence. One HR representative actually said, over the phone, "So you've been a stay-at-home mom for 10 years? Then your knowledge of the current market is essentially zero. Why would we hire you over a recent graduate?" Another sent a form rejection that read, "Your background does not match our current needs, but we will keep your resume on file for future opportunities." On file. In the digital trash can, more likely. I started to spiral. The doubts crept in at night, when Sophie was asleep and the apartment was quiet, and there was nothing to distract me from the voice in my head. Maybe Derek had been right. Maybe I really was unemployable. Maybe I really had ruined my life by leaving. Maybe I should have just kept my head down and endured the marriage, the way women had been doing for centuries, because the alternative, this, was worse. At least in the marriage, I had a roof over my head and food in the refrigerator. Now I had a futon that hurt my back and a savings account that was dwindling by the day and a daughter who depended on me for everything. What did I actually have to offer anyone? 10 years of folding laundry and making breakfast and scheduling playdates. 10 years of skills that no employer cared about. 10 years of professional knowledge that had rusted and decayed from disuse. The financial models I used to build, the software I used to run, all of it had changed, evolved, moved on without me. 10 years is an eternity in finance. And I had spent that eternity in a kitchen. But every time I looked at Sophie's face, her small, serious face, the face of a girl who had stood barefoot between her parents and refused to move, I told myself I couldn't give up. I couldn't let her see her mother defeated. I couldn't teach her, by example, that this was what happened to women who tried to stand up for themselves. She needed to see me rise. She needed to know that it was possible, because someday, God forbid, she might find herself in a similar situation, and I wanted her to remember, my mother got out. My mother survived. My mother built something from nothing. So I kept going. Zoe Harper saved my life. Not literally. There was no dramatic rescue, no single moment of salvation. But in the slow, cumulative way that certain friendships operate, she was the force that pulled me back from the edge and set me on solid ground. She was my college roommate and my best friend in the world, and she had been, for the past 10 years, the one person I could never quite bring myself to tell the whole truth to. Because telling Zoe the truth would have meant admitting how far I had fallen. And admitting that to Zoe, Zoe who had built a career in tech, Zoe who had started her own consulting firm, Zoe who had never, not once, let a man tell her what she was worth, would have been the final, unbearable confirmation of my failure. We had met freshman year at Northwestern, randomly assigned as roommates. She was from New York, loud and funny and terrifyingly confident, the kind of person who walked into a room and immediately owned it. I was from the Chicago suburbs, quieter, more cautious, the daughter of immigrants who had taught me to work twice as hard and expect half as much. We should have clashed. Instead, we became inseparable. For 4 years, we shared a cramped dorm room and our deepest secrets. She knew about my crush on the barista at the campus coffee shop. I knew about her complicated, on-again, off-again relationship with a philosophy major who wrote her terrible poetry. We pulled all-nighters together, ate cheap pizza together, got caught sneaking wine into the dorms together. We promised each other, on graduation day, that we would always be in each other's lives. And then life happened. I got married and disappeared into domesticity. She moved to New York, then San Francisco, then back to New York, building a career that seemed to rise in an unbroken arc. We saw each other less and less. A wedding here, a baby shower there, but the bond never frayed. Not really. It just went dormant, waiting for the right conditions to bloom again. The conditions arrived 1 month after my divorce, when Zoe heard about it from a mutual friend. She called me that night, and my phone rang for a long time before I could make myself answer. I stared at her name on the screen, Zoe Redhart, and my thumb hovered over the green button, paralyzed by a shame so deep it felt physical. How do you call your best friend and say, "My husband threw me out, and I haven't worked in 10 years, and I'm terrified I'm going to fail and lose my daughter"? But I answered. And the moment I heard her voice, Lena, talk to me. What's going on? The dam broke. I sobbed into the phone, ugly and uncontrollable, the kind of crying I hadn't let myself do since the night of the slap. Zoe didn't interrupt. She just listened, her breathing steady on the other end of the line, a quiet anchor in the storm. When I finally ran out of tears, she said, "Okay, here's what we're going to do." She made me send her my resume. She tore it apart, not cruelly, but with the surgical precision of someone who knew exactly what hiring managers were looking for. Too wordy. Your strengths are buried. This 10-year gap, don't apologize for it. Just state it. Full-time family caregiver. Own it. And this investment performance? You beat the market 3 years out of 10? Lena, that's genuinely impressive. Why is it buried in a footnote? Put it front and center. She revised my resume 5 times. Each draft was sharper, cleaner, more confident. On the 5th draft, she paused and said, "Lena, do you realize that you're actually really qualified for a lot of positions? The problem isn't your resume. It's that you've been told for 10 years that you're worthless, and you've started to believe it. We need to fix that." She ran me through mock interviews, 3 of them, each one more grueling than the last. The first one, I stammered and froze and couldn't string a coherent sentence together. She was gentle but honest. That was rough. Let's do it again. The second was better, but I kept glancing at her face for approval, seeking validation like a student terrified of giving the wrong answer. She called me out on it. "Stop looking at me like I'm your judge. You know this stuff. Trust yourself." The third mock interview, she came at me with every curveball she could think of, technical questions, case studies, rapid-fire follow-ups designed to trip me up. And something clicked. I stopped thinking about whether I sounded smart enough. I stopped worrying about the 10-year gap. I just answered the questions, drawing on knowledge I hadn't even realized I still possessed, and the words came out clean and precise and confident. When we finished, she slammed her hand on the table and said, "There. That's the Lena Brooks I remember. She's been in there all along." The morning of the real interview, I woke up at 5, my stomach a knot of nerves. I showered, did my hair. It took 3 tries to get it right, and put on the only decent business outfit I owned. It was a navy blazer and matching trousers, bought 5 years ago at a clearance sale. I tried it on in the store, thinking I looked powerful, capable. Derek had seen it hanging in the closet and said, "Why do you need a suit? You don't work." So I'd buried it in the back, behind the winter coats, and never worn it. Pulling it out now felt like an act of defiance. It smelled faintly of mothballs, so I ironed it twice and sprayed it with the last of my good perfume. Standing in front of the bathroom mirror, I looked at myself. The woman who looked back was not the woman from the wedding photograph. She was older, more tired, with lines around her eyes and a few strands of gray at her temples. But she was standing. She was dressed. She was ready. "You can do this," I told her. "You are smart, you are qualified, and you deserve to be here." It felt ridiculous, saying it out loud to my own reflection. But it also felt necessary. I had spent 10 years being told I was worthless. I needed to start telling myself something different. Apex Technologies occupied the top 8 floors of a glass and steel tower in the Loop. The lobby was all polished granite and modern art, the kind of space designed to make you feel small and impressed. I gave my name to the security guard and was issued a visitor badge. My hands were trembling as I clipped it to my blazer. The receptionist, a cheerful young woman named Chloe Adams who couldn't have been older than 23, led me to a glass-walled conference room on the 34th floor and asked me to wait. Through the glass, I could see the open-plan office humming with quiet energy. Young professionals typing at standing desks, data visualizations scrolling across a massive wall screen. The smell of fresh coffee drifting from a break room that looked like it belonged in a design magazine. I sat in the conference room, my back straight, my hands folded on the table, and tried to calm my breathing. I hadn't been in a professional environment like this in 10 years. The last time I sat in a conference room, I had been the one on the other side of the table, the one with the power. Now I was the supplicant, hoping to be found worthy. The door opened, and a man walked in. He was in his early 40s, medium build, with silver-framed glasses and a navy polo shirt. He had an easy, approachable manner, the kind of person who puts you at ease without seeming to try. He introduced himself as Frank Callahan, Director of Marketing, and explained that the head of finance, Richard Donovan, had asked him to sit in on the interview because the role involved close collaboration between departments. He sat down across from me, my resume in his hand, and flipped through it twice. I watched his eyes move across the page, trying to read his expression, trying to gauge whether I had already been dismissed. "Ms. Brooks," he said, "you majored in finance at Northwestern. You spent 2 years at Meridian Financial as an analyst. That's a respected firm. But your resume is blank from age 25 to 35. What have you been doing?" I took a breath. I got married and had a daughter. My husband wanted me to stay home with her. I made the choice to prioritize my family. I paused, then added, "It was a choice I now regret. But it was my choice, and I don't want to make excuses for it." He nodded, his expression unreadable. "Fair enough. During those 10 years, did you do anything related to your field? Anything at all that kept your skills engaged?" "Yes." I straightened my spine, remembering Zoe's advice. "Own it." I wasn't formally employed, but I never stopped following the markets. I read financial news every day. I tracked market movements and maintained several simulated trading accounts to test my strategies. My best simulated portfolio last year returned 18%. I pulled up a screenshot on my phone and slid it across the table. Frank picked it up, studied it, and his eyebrows rose slightly. "You were raising a child alone, and you still pulled an 18% annualized return. 18 was just last year. The year before was a little over 20. My 10-year average is around 12 to 13%. He set down my phone, took off his glasses, polished them on his shirt, a surprisingly human gesture, and put them back on. He leaned forward. "Tell me your read on the current market." Just off the cuff. I took a deep breath and started talking. Everything I had been cramming for weeks poured out. Macro trends, sector rotation patterns, the impact of Fed policy on emerging markets, regulatory shifts, technical indicators, valuation fundamentals. I talked about the yield curve and consumer sentiment and the ripple effects of geopolitical instability. The words came faster and smoother as I went, and it felt like surfacing after holding my breath underwater for a decade, finally gasping in air. Frank started jotting notes. When I paused for breath, he looked up and said, "If I gave you a team, could you lead it?" "Yes," I said, without hesitation. "You haven't worked in 10 years. Leading a team is going to be a huge adjustment. You sure you're ready for that?" "I am." My voice was quiet but steady. "For the past 10 years, I've been solely responsible for running an entire household. Budgeting, scheduling, logistics, education, healthcare, crisis management. Running a household and running a team have more in common than most people think. Limited resources, tight deadlines, competing priorities. I know how to delegate, how to manage parallel work streams, and how to make decisions under uncertainty. The scale is different, but the principles are the same." Frank stared at me for a long moment. Then he pushed his glasses up, let out a short, surprised laugh, and said, "Ms. Brooks, I now genuinely believe you worked at Meridian." He stood and extended his hand. "Our financial analysis department needs a supervisor. The position starts at $4,000 a month, 3-month probation period. Are you interested? For $1,000 a month." I shook his hand, my palms sweaty, my heart hammering. "Yes, I'm very interested." When I walked out of Apex Technologies and stood on the front steps, the afternoon sun was warm on my face, and my legs felt like they might give out. I stood there for a long moment, letting the sun soak into my skin, letting the reality of what had just happened settle over me. This was the first paycheck in 10 years that I would earn entirely on my own. Not for buying groceries, not for picking up Sophie, not for begging anyone for anything. It was mine. I called Zoe from the sidewalk. She picked up on the first ring. "Well?" "I got it. Supervisor. For $1,000 a month." 1 second of stunned silence. Then a scream, not an excited shriek, but something more primal, more cathartic, as if she had been holding her breath for a decade and had finally let it out. I knew it. "Lena Brooks, you absolute legend. 4,000 a month. You know that's more than Derek makes, right? You know that, right? You are a goddamn superstar." I stood on the sidewalk, phone pressed to my ear, laughing and crying at the same time, and I didn't care who saw me. A few pedestrians glanced over, probably wondering why a woman in a business suit was weeping on the corner of Wacker Drive. I didn't care. I had done it. After 10 years of darkness, I had finally found a crack of light. That evening, I picked Sophie up from school and took her out for ice cream, a rare treat, given our budget. We sat on a bench outside the shop, watching the cars go by, and I told her, "Mommy got a job." Sophie's face lit up. "Really, Mommy? Where?" "At a big company downtown." I'm going to be a supervisor. She didn't fully understand what that meant, but she understood that it was good, that her mother was happy, and that was enough. Does that mean we can sign up for the art class? She asked, her voice cautiously hopeful. The teacher says the deadline is Friday. I pulled her into my arms, right there on the bench, and held her tight. Yes, baby. Mommy will sign you up tomorrow. She wrapped her arms around my neck and whispered, Mommy, you're the best. I held her close, my chin resting on top of her head, and watched the sun sink behind the buildings. For the first time in a very long time, the future didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a promise. My first day at Apex, I arrived early, too nervous to be late. Chloe from the front desk gave me the full tour, break room, conference rooms, which executives sat where. I followed her, memorizing the layout, my new heels clicking on the polished concrete floors. This was the woman whom Derek had declared helpless without a man, and she was walking through a billion-dollar tech company as a newly hired supervisor, her badge clipped to her blazer, her head held high. When we passed the marketing department, Chloe was explaining their team structure. Frank runs the whole show, and he's got 3 team leads under him, and we're hiring like crazy right now. When I suddenly spotted a familiar silhouette at a workstation by the window, my steps faltered for a fraction of a second. Chloe didn't notice. I dropped my gaze, pretending to check my phone, and let my peripheral vision do the work. That curve of the shoulders, the way he leaned back in his chair with his legs crossed, the way he tilted his head when he was trying to charm someone. I had studied that posture for 10 years. I could have identified it in the dark, in a crowd, from 100 yards away. Derek Brooks. He was sitting at a desk in the open marketing area, his computer screen glowing with an unfinished spreadsheet. He was twirling a pen between his fingers, leaning toward a young female colleague, and saying something that made her laugh, her hand covering her mouth. He looked relaxed, confident, like he belonged there. My stomach clenched. For one wild, irrational moment, I wanted to turn around and walk out of the building, to quit before I'd even started. How could I work in the same company as him? How could I see him every day, pass him in the hallway, sit in meetings with him, and not fall apart? But then I thought about Sophie, about the night of the slap, about the way she had planted her small body between me and her father and refused to move. If a 7-year-old could be that brave, so could I. I pulled my gaze away and kept walking. A few steps later, Chloe's voice floated back to me. This is the marketing department. They're in a major hiring push. We just brought on a few new people last week. They're all still in their probation period. Oh, I heard myself say, my voice perfectly neutral. How many new hires? 3, she said, ticking them off on her fingers. A designer, a strategist, and someone named Derek, I think. He used to be a marketing manager somewhere. Marketing manager. I nearly laughed out loud. His last job had been marketing manager at a mid-sized firm, a little over $3,000 a month, managing a team of 5. The company had gone through a rough patch and laid off a wave of employees, Derek among them, though he had told everyone he knew that he had resigned voluntarily to pursue better opportunities. So this was his better opportunity, a probationary junior role at the same company where his ex-wife was now his superior. The universe, I decided, had a very dark sense of humor. As soon as the tour ended, I went straight to Frank Callahan's office. I closed the door behind me and sat down across from his desk. He was mid-pour on a cup of coffee from the elaborate espresso machine he kept in the corner. Frank, let me ask you about someone. Shoot. Did your department hire a guy named Derek Brooks last week? Frank's hand froze, the coffee pot suspended in midair. You know him? He's my ex-husband. The coffee pot hovered for a solid 3 seconds before Frank set it down very carefully and ran a hand over his gleaming scalp. Lena, he said, that's a hell of a thing to drop on a guy who hasn't finished his morning coffee. I gave him the short version. Not everything. Not the slap. Not the years of belittling. Not the details that were still too raw to speak aloud. But enough. Enough for him to understand exactly what kind of man Derek Brooks was. Frank's frown deepened with every sentence. He got in through some friend-of-a-friend connection that reached our VP, Richard Donovan, Frank said. Richard hates that kind of backdoor stuff, but he couldn't blow off a business partner's request, so he said let him try out. 3 months probation. If he doesn't perform, he's out. Frank looked at me, his expression sharp. What do you want to do? One word from me, and HR issues his termination notice this afternoon. You've got more than enough grounds. I thought about it. The temptation was strong, to just be rid of him, to never have to see his face again. But something deeper, something colder, held me back. No, I said. Let him stay. Frank's eyebrows shot up. You're kidding. After everything he did. I don't want to keep him, I said. I want to give him 3 months. 3 months for what? 3 months to realize exactly how he's going to lose. Frank stared at me, and then a slow, appreciative grin spread across his face. Lena Brooks, he said, you are a lot colder than you look. Not cold, I said. He taught me something useful. Mercy to an enemy is cruelty to yourself. I'm done being cruel to myself. Derek discovered I was working at Apex on his 3rd day. He was carrying a stack of files out of the marketing department when he rounded a corner and nearly collided with me in the hallway. He stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes dropped from my face to the badge clipped to my blazer. Lena Brooks, Supervisor, Financial Analysis Department. The sequence of expressions that crossed his face was something I would replay in my mind for weeks afterward. First, total disbelief. He literally read my badge twice, his lips moving slightly as he sounded out the words. Then confusion, as his brain struggled to reconcile the image of his helpless ex-wife with the title Supervisor. Then, finally, a churning mixture of humiliation and fury and something else he was trying very hard not to show. Fear. A thin, sharp sliver of fear, hidden behind the anger but unmistakable to someone who had spent 10 years learning to read his every micro-expression. Lena. His voice cracked on the 2nd syllable. What are you doing here? Working. Working here? At Apex? As a supervisor? His voice climbed half an octave, and a few people in the hallway turned to glance at us before looking away. I started a few days ago, I said, my voice calm, unhurried. We're colleagues now, Derek. I'd suggest you watch your tone. His face flushed a deep, ugly crimson. I could see the rage boiling behind his eyes, the string of insults he was barely choking back. He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a venomous hiss. Did you follow me here? Did you investigate me? Is this some kind of sick revenge thing? I let a small, cool smile touch the corner of my mouth. You're flattering yourself. I got this job without any idea you were here. It turns out the world doesn't actually revolve around you. Derek, I know that's difficult for you to process. He stood there, gripping the files so hard his knuckles went white, his jaw working as if he were physically chewing on the words he wanted to say. But there was nothing he could say. Not here, not in this hallway, with colleagues passing by and his probationary status hanging over his head. Finally, he turned and stalked off, his footsteps loud and angry on the polished floor. I watched him go, and I felt something unexpected, absolutely nothing. No fear, no anger, no residual ache of the love I had once felt. Just a cool, detached observation, like a scientist watching a specimen in a lab. The man who had dominated my life for 10 years, who had made me feel small and worthless and afraid, was now just another employee in a company where I outranked him. The power had shifted so completely, so silently, that I hadn't even noticed it happening. That night, Zoe called me, howling with laughter after Frank filled her in. Lena, this is an actual masterpiece. Your ex-husband is now your subordinate. Well, your peer's subordinate, which is even better. A probationary peon, and you're a department supervisor. The man who used to bark orders at you has to step aside when you walk past in the hallway. This is poetry. This is Shakespearean. I didn't plan it, I said. But now that he's here, I'm not going to waste the opportunity. He's going to come after you, you know? He's not going to just accept this quietly. Let him. The harder he swings, the faster he'll fall. Zoe was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, more serious. Lena, I have to say, you sound different. You sound like yourself again. The self I knew in college. I've missed her. So have I said. So have I. Derek's campaign of sabotage began almost immediately. He couldn't confront me directly. We were in different departments, and Frank had made it clear that any personal conflict would be dealt with harshly. So he did what he had always done. He worked in the shadows, in the gray areas, in the spaces where deniability was still possible. His role in the marketing department required him to supply my team with regular market data, consumer trend reports, competitive analysis, regional sales figures. It was foundational work, the raw material from which my analysts built their models. And almost from the start, The data he sent was wrong. At first, I thought it might be incompetence. The datasets would arrive late, or incomplete, or formatted in ways that made them difficult to use. I gave him the benefit of the doubt. He was new. After all, still learning the systems. I sent polite emails asking him to correct the errors. He apologized, promised to do better, and then sent the next batch with the same problems. By the third incident, I stopped giving him the benefit of the doubt. I went to Frank with a request. I need a full audit trail of every dataset Derek has submitted, compared against the original source files in your system. Frank's team ran the audit. The results were damning. The data Derek was sending me had been altered, not randomly, but deliberately. Key indicators had been stripped out, numbers subtly adjusted, labels changed to make the files confusing and difficult to use. And the alterations had been made manually by someone logged into Derek's account. Frank called him into his office and laid the evidence on the table. Derek's face remained perfectly, infuriatingly calm. "I don't know how that happened," he said, his voice smooth and reasonable. "I must have made an error in the export process. You know how glitchy this software can be. I'm still learning it." It was a lie, and everyone in the room knew it was a lie. But it was a lie that danced right on the edge of plausibility, not outright fraud, not a fireable offense on its own, just a pattern of mistakes that happened to benefit him and harm me. Frank couldn't fire him for it. Not yet. But he put a formal warning in Derek's file and told him, in no uncertain terms, that one more error would result in immediate termination. Derek walked out of Frank's office with an expression of wounded innocence. But when he passed me in the hallway, the mask slipped. He cut his eyes at me, and the look on his face was pure, undisguised hatred. The Real explosion came a month later, during a high-stakes joint project with Red Peak Group, one of the largest logistics firms in the Midwest. The deal was potentially worth millions, and Richard Donovan himself was overseeing it. Frank's marketing team was responsible for data collection and market research. My team was responsible for analysis, modeling, and strategy. The timeline was brutally tight, 2 weeks from kickoff to final delivery. Richard had made it clear, land this project, and bonuses would double. Fail, and both departments would face serious consequences. Derek was assigned to the project team, responsible for collecting and organizing the foundational market data. It was basic work, the kind of work an intern could do, but it was also critical. If the data at the source was flawed, every analysis downstream would be worthless. 3 days into the project, Derek sent a message to the project group chat. "Lena, sorry to do this, but I've discovered that the market data I submitted earlier is incomplete. I missed several key regions. I'll need about 2 days to recollect and resubmit." 2 days. In a 2-week project timeline, a 2-day delay at the data stage would cascade through every subsequent phase, pushing my team's analysis to the absolute last minute and leaving no room for error or revision. It was, in other words, a sabotage designed to make me fail. Frank, reading the message, called Derek immediately. "You need 2 more days? Why wasn't this caught earlier? Do you have any idea what this does to the project schedule?" Derek's voice, through the phone, was perfectly contrite. "I know, Frank. I'm really sorry. I was doing a final check and just noticed it. I'm working as fast as I can. It was a performance. A very good performance. But I had been watching him perform for 10 years, and I could see the strings. That night, after Sophie was asleep, I opened my laptop and went to work. I had kept copies of every data file Derek had ever sent me, a habit I had developed at Meridian, where Fiona had taught me that documentation was the first and best defense against disaster. I cross-referenced Derek's incomplete submission against the raw data in the company's database. It took me until 2 in the morning, but by the time I finished, I had found exactly what I expected. The missing data wasn't missing. It was in the original database, complete and accurate. Derek had simply not included it, and he had hidden his tracks by renaming fields, burying crucial indicators in obscure tabs, and hoping no one would bother to check. I screenshotted everything. Timestamps, file names, modification logs, the complete, incontrovertible chain of evidence. I compiled it all into a report and sent it to Frank at 2:13 a.m. The next morning, Frank called me. "I read your report, and it's termination level. Clear evidence of deliberate data manipulation with intent to sabotage a major project. Legal is ready to move." "Good," I said, "but not yet. Lena, The project comes first. We can't afford the disruption of firing him midstream. Let him finish his data collection. Let him think he's getting away with it. Then, when the project is delivered and the contract is signed, then we deal with him." Frank was silent for a moment. "You know," he said finally, "when I first met you, I thought you were nice. Polite. A little timid, maybe. I was wrong about you. I was wrong about myself," I said. For a long time. The project was delivered on schedule. My team worked around the clock, compensating for the delays Derek had tried to create, building models and running stress tests, and polishing the presentation until every slide was flawless. On delivery day, Victor Lang, the CEO of Red Peak Group, a man in his early 50s with a reputation for being brutally demanding, sat in our conference room for 4 hours. He read every page of our analysis. He questioned every assumption. He challenged every conclusion. My team answered every question. When Victor pushed, we pushed back. When he demanded to see the raw data behind a particular projection, we had it ready. When he tried to poke holes in our Monte Carlo simulation, we walked him through the methodology step by step, and by the end, he was nodding. "Ms. Brooks," he said, taking off his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose, "I've been in this business for 20 years. I've worked with dozens of consulting firms, analysts, strategists. This is some of the best work I've ever seen. Who built this model?" "My team and I said. "Together." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he closed the proposal, slid it across the table, and said, "You've got the contract." That afternoon, after the Red Peak team had left and the conference room had emptied, I sat alone in the silence and let myself feel it. Not just the relief, there was plenty of that, but something deeper. Pride. I had done this. Not Derek. Not anyone else. Me. The woman who had been told she was worthless. The woman who had been slapped across the face and told she would never survive on her own. She had just landed a multi-million-dollar contract for her company. I thought about calling Derek, just to hear the sound of his voice when I told him. I didn't, of course. That would have been petty. But I allowed myself a moment to savor the thought. Richard Donovan called me into his office the next morning. His office was on the top floor, with a view that stretched across the entire Chicago skyline. The lake glittering in the distance, the skyscrapers rising like monuments to ambition. "Lena," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk, "sit down." I sat. He came around from behind his desk and sat in the chair next to me, rather than across from me. A small gesture, but one that signaled respect. "Victor Lang called me last night," he said. "He told me your analysis was among the best he's seen in his entire career. He said you and your team made every other vendor he's worked with look like amateurs. He also said," Richard paused, a small smile playing at the corner of his mouth, "that if I ever let you leave this company, he'll personally consider it an act of war." I laughed, surprised. "That's quite a compliment." "It is, and it's one you earned." He leaned back in his chair. "Lena, I'm not going to pretend I know everything about your situation. Frank told me some of it. Enough to understand that you've had a rough road. But what I see in front of me is one of the sharpest analysts I've ever worked with. So I'm promoting you. I want you to head the entire strategic analysis division. All of it. You'll report directly to me. Your salary will reflect the increased responsibility." I blinked. "Richard, I've been here less than 6 months." "I know. And you've already proven yourself more valuable than people who've been here for years. The timeline doesn't matter. The results do." I walked out of his office and stood in the empty hallway for a long moment, the weight of what had just happened settling over me. 6 months earlier, I had been a terrified housewife, standing in a shattered living room with a bruise blooming on her cheek. Now I was the head of strategic analysis at a billion-dollar company. The arc of a life can bend so sharply, so suddenly, that it takes your breath away. Derek's probation period ended while I was away in Denver, overseeing the opening of Apex's new regional branch. Frank wrote the evaluation himself: data falsification, deliberate project sabotage, hostile workplace behavior. 3 counts, each one supported by documented evidence. The termination was swift and final. I heard about it from Frank over the phone. "He's gone," Frank said. "Cleared out his desk this morning. Didn't go quietly. Made a scene. Said you had a personal vendetta against him. Said I was taking your side because you and I were sleeping together. Security had to escort him out." I felt a strange, unexpected pang. Not sympathy, exactly, but something adjacent to it. The memory of the man in the wedding photograph, the one with the crooked tie and the joyful kiss. That man had existed once. I had loved him once. And now he was being escorted out of a building by security guards, a cardboard box of his belongings in his arms, shouting accusations at anyone who would listen. "Are you okay?" Frank asked. "I'm fine," I said. And I was. I really was. I saw Derek one last time. I happened to be back in Chicago for meetings, and I was walking through the lobby when I spotted him by the elevator bank, a cardboard box in his arms. The box contained his water bottle, a few notebooks, and a framed photo of Sophie, the one from when she was 3, her hair in pigtails, grinning at the camera. He saw me and stopped. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. He looked older than I remembered, the lines on his face deeper, his posture less confident. The bravado had drained out of him, leaving something smaller and more human behind. "Lena, Derek, they let me go. I know." He shifted the box in his arms. Frank wrote the evaluation. 3 counts. Every one of them true. He let out a humorless laugh. "You were right. I shouldn't have done those things." I leaned against the wall, watching him. The afternoon light slanted through the lobby windows, casting long rectangles of gold across the marble floor. Somewhere in the distance, a phone was ringing. "Victor Lang offered me a job," Derek said. "At Red Peak. Lower pay than here, but it's something," he said. He paused, and the words seemed to cost him a physical effort. "He said you were the best analyst he'd ever worked with. He said you were better than me." I looked at this man, the man I had loved and hated and finally, mercifully, stopped caring about, and I felt nothing but a vast, clean, liberating emptiness. He was no longer my problem. He was no longer my wound. He was just a person, standing in a lobby, holding a cardboard box. "You once asked me," I said, "what a housewife could possibly use to fight you. Do you remember that?" He didn't answer, but the flicker in his eyes told me he remembered. "Here's your answer," I said. "Myself. The version of me you never bothered to see. The version of me you spent 10 years trying to bury. She's the one who beat you." The elevator doors opened. He stepped inside. Just before they closed, I saw his mouth twitch into something that might have been a smile. Not smug, not cruel, just sad. The smile of a man who had finally, too late, understood what he had lost. Then the doors closed, and he was gone. Sophie and I moved to Denver full-time that fall. The branch office had grown from 5 people to 30, and Richard had asked me to stay on as its permanent director. I found a small house in a quiet neighborhood, with a backyard where Sophie could play and a spare room I turned into a home office. The house wasn't fancy, nothing like the condo in Chicago, but it was ours. Every piece of furniture, every picture on the wall, every book on the shelf, was a choice we had made together. Sophie thrived. She made friends at her new school, joined the art club, and started taking classes at a local studio on weekends. Her drawings covered the refrigerator and the walls of her bedroom. Fantastical landscapes, superheroes with capes made of stars, a recurring figure of a woman in a business suit standing on top of a skyscraper. "That's you, Mommy," she would say, pointing at the woman. "You're the superhero." One evening, after dinner, she asked me, very seriously, "Mommy, do you ever miss Daddy?" I put down my fork and looked at her. "Sometimes," I said honestly. "Not the way he was at the end, but the way he was at the beginning. I miss the person I thought he was." She nodded, as if this made perfect sense. "I miss him too," she said. "But I don't want to live with him again. I like it here. Just us. Just us." I repeated, and the words felt like a blessing. The day Apex went public, Richard Donovan threw a celebration gala at the company headquarters. Everyone was there, the Chicago team, the Denver team, the early employees who had believed in the company when it was nothing but a startup in a rented office. Sophie came with me, wearing a new white dress, her hair pinned back with a clip she had chosen herself. She sat at a table near the front, a glass of sparkling apple juice in her hand, watching the stage with the wide-eyed seriousness of a child who understands that something important is happening. Richard took the stage and gave a speech about the company's journey, about the risks and the setbacks and the moments of triumph. Then he paused and looked across the room until he found my face. "I want to take a moment to recognize someone who joined this company less than 2 years ago," he said. When Lena Brooks walked into her interview, someone told me she'd been out of the workforce for 10 years. They said she might not be able to handle the pressure. They said the gap was too big, The industry had moved on. The risk was too high. I hired her anyway, not because I'm particularly brave, but because she walked into that room and within 5 minutes, I knew she was the smartest person in it. The room laughed. Sophie clapped her hands together, her face glowing. Since then, Richard continued, Lena has led some of the most important projects this company has ever undertaken. She built our strategic analysis division from the ground up. She opened our Denver branch and turned it into one of our highest performing offices. The Red Peak partnership, which you all know was a game changer for us, happened because she walked into a conference room and convinced one of the toughest CEOs in the industry that we knew his business better than he did. She did all of this while raising a daughter on her own, while rebuilding her life from scratch, while proving to herself and to everyone around her that it is never, ever too late to start over. He raised his glass. To Lena Brooks, the heart of this company. The applause was thunderous. I sat frozen in my seat, overwhelmed, unable to move. Zoe, who had flown in from New York for the gala, reached over and squeezed my hand. Get up there, she hissed. Go. I stood, my legs unsteady, and walked to the stage. The microphone felt heavy in my hand. The faces looking up at me were a blur. Frank, grinning with his crooked teeth. Chloe, dabbing at her eyes with a napkin. Jason, holding up his phone. And Fiona Mercer, my old boss from Meridian, who had driven in from the suburbs just to be here, sitting at a back table in a dark blue dress, her eyes holding an expression I recognized. It was the same expression she'd had when she walked me to the elevator 10 years ago, except back then, it had been worry. Now it was pride. I took a breath. 10 years ago, I said, I walked into my supervisor's office and told her I was leaving. I told her I didn't need a career because I had a husband who was going to take care of me. I believed that, completely, and without reservation. And for a while, it seemed like the right choice. But somewhere along the way, the choice stopped being mine. I became someone I didn't recognize. I became someone who was told, every day, in 1,000 small ways, that she was worthless without her husband. The room had gone very quiet. Sophie was looking up at me, her apple juice forgotten. 2 years ago, I hit the lowest point of my life. I was standing in my living room, in the wreckage of everything I had built, and the person I had trusted most in the world told me I was nothing. He told me I would never survive on my own. He told me I was a housewife, and that I had nothing to fight him with. I paused, letting the silence stretch. He was wrong. Someone in the back of the room, I think it was Frank, let out a whoop. A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. He was wrong, I repeated, because he didn't understand what I understand now. Being a housewife isn't a weakness. It's not a void on a resume. It's a decade of managing budgets and schedules and crises. It's learning how to negotiate with a toddler in a boardroom full of executives. And honestly, the toddler is sometimes harder. It's developing the kind of resilience that comes from being responsible for another human being's entire existence. The skills I learned in those 10 years, the patience, the resourcefulness, the ability to function on no sleep and no encouragement. Those are the skills that made me the professional I am today. I looked down at Sophie. She was standing on her chair now, her small face shining. So if you're out there and you're going through something hard, if you feel like you've lost yourself, like you've given too much to the wrong person, like it's too late to start over, I want you to know this. It is never too late. You are not your resume gap. You are not your worst moment. You are not what someone else told you were. You are what you choose to become. And I promise you, I promise, that if you keep fighting, if you keep believing, the reward will come. It might be late. It might take years. But it will never, ever fail to arrive. I raised my glass. To second chances. The room erupted. People were on their feet. Frank, Zoe, Chloe, Jason, Fiona, even Richard Donovan, standing at the edge of the stage with his glass raised. Sophie was jumping up and down on her chair, shouting, "That's my mommy. That's my mommy." I stood on that stage, tears running freely down my face, and I let the applause wash over me like a wave. It had taken 35 years, a shattered teacup, and the courage of a 7-year-old girl to get me here. But I was here. Finally, completely, irrevocably here. Later that night, after the gala had ended and Sophie was asleep in our hotel room, I drove out to the old neighborhood. I parked across the street from the building where we used to live and rolled down the window. The balcony was still there. The flower pots were gone, and the curtains behind the glass were a different color, someone else's life, unfolding in the space I used to occupy. I sat in the car for a long time, thinking about the woman who used to stand on that balcony, hanging laundry and watching the street below. She had been so tired, so lonely, so certain that her life was as good as it was ever going to get. I wanted to reach back through time and tell her, hold on. It gets better. You have no idea how much better it gets. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a photo album labeled 10 years ago. Derek holding newborn Sophie, his arms stiff with terror, his face full of a love so raw and real that it made my chest ache. That man had existed. I hadn't imagined him. He had been real, and I had loved him. And then, somewhere along the way, we had both lost ourselves. But I had found myself again. That was the difference. He was still out there, still lost, still blaming everyone but himself for his failures. And I was here, in a car on a quiet street, with a future stretching out in front of me like an open road. I closed the album, put the car in drive, and headed home. When I got back to the hotel, Sophie was still asleep, her face peaceful, her hand curled around the stuffed rabbit she'd had since she was a baby. I sat on the edge of her bed and stroked her hair. She stirred, murmured something unintelligible, and rolled over. On the nightstand, my phone buzzed. A message from Fiona. Lena, I was so proud of you tonight. I've been proud of you for 10 years. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I typed back. You told me exactly what I needed to hear, exactly when I needed to hear it. I just wasn't ready to listen yet. Thank you for never giving up on me. Another message from Zoe. A photo of me on stage, glass raised, tears on my face, Sophie visible in the foreground standing on her chair. Caption, my best friend. The most badass woman I know. I smiled, set the phone aside, and lay down beside Sophie. The moon was full outside the window, casting silver light across the floor. I closed my eyes and let the quiet settle over me. Tomorrow there would be new challenges, new projects, new moments of doubt and fear and uncertainty. But I wasn't afraid of them anymore. Not because the challenges had gotten smaller, because I had gotten bigger. Big enough to hold everything I had lost and everything I had gained. Big enough to turn my wounds into wisdom and my pain into power. It had taken me 10 years to walk through the darkness. 10 years of tunnels and dead ends and moments when I was certain I would never see daylight again. But I had kept walking, one foot in front of the other, even when I couldn't see the path. And now, finally, I had reached the other side. The other side was not a destination. It was not a finish line. It was an ongoing journey, a daily choice to keep showing up, to keep fighting, to keep believing that I was worth the effort. And I was. God, I was. I pulled Sophie close, felt her small, warm body curl against mine, and let myself drift. Outside, the moon shone on, indifferent and beautiful, washing the city in silver. Inside, in the quiet of the hotel room, a woman who had once been lost held her daughter and slept, finally, in peace.